President Trump wraps up a 4-day visit to the Middle East, including a major speech in Saudi Arabia and a meeting with the new leader of Syria. What are some of the highlights from this trip, and how is Trump now steering U.S. foreign policy in the Mideast in his second term?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, Elliot Kaufman and Kate Batchelder Odell. In the first overseas travel of his second term, President Trump this week visited Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. And the leaders of those countries have certainly rolled out the red carpet, or in the Saudis' case, it was a lavender carpet. The greeting in Qatar included mounted camels and red Tesla Cybertrucks. And don't forget about that gift of a 747 jet that Trump wants to retrofit to use as Air Force One. Elliot, plenty of news has been made on this trip, and we'll talk about some of the specifics. But what's your read overall on what this trip says about Trump's foreign policy toward the Middle East in his second term?
I think that's the right question to ask. I mean, this was his first major foreign trip, and he took it not to London, Ottawa, Berlin, Tokyo. Instead he went to Riyadh, and I think that means something. The very first thing that I would say is the Middle East clearly isn't peripheral to Trump's foreign policy vision, as some have been pushing for over many years. Let's stop thinking about the Middle East, focus elsewhere. Well, the Middle East brings U.S. presidents back, and I think we are seeing that now. Now, I mean, what did Trump come to do? He came to make deals, I would say. Huge deals, dollar figures with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. The exact figures, $1 trillion each, are more of a marketing gimmick than reality. But I would say they're meant to be taken seriously, not literally in this case. They, include many past commitments, some future commitments that can't be met if we don't want to drive our allies into bankruptcy, but take them seriously at the same time. I mean, what is actually happening here? The U.S. is selling arms and technology in a big way to these Gulf Arab allies. Why do that? Build them up, keep them firmly in the U.S. camp, and not sort of continue their drift toward China. And I think looking to them to empower them to take care of regional business. And Trump's Syria policy has a lot to do with that, but that's what I would look to. And do I call it a vision for the region? I may not be all the way there, but I'm getting close, Kyle. Something like that.
One of the headline moments was a speech by President Trump in Riyadh at the Saudi U.S. Investment Forum. The White House is calling this a major address in which he outlined an optimistic vision for the future of the Middle East and his approach to achieving a more stable region. Let's listen to part of what President Trump told that audience.
Before our eyes, a new generation of leaders is transcending the ancient conflicts of tired divisions of the past and forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, where it exports technology, not terrorism, and where people of different nations, religions, and creeds are building cities together, not bombing each other out of existence. We don't want that.
Also notable in this speech was some pretty pointed criticism of past U.S. foreign policy and President Trump's predecessors in the Oval Office. Listen to this.
The gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions and trillions of dollars failing to develop Kabul, Baghdad, so many other cities. Instead, the birth of a modern Middle East has been brought by the people of the region themselves, the people that are right here, the people that have lived here all their lives, developing your own sovereign countries, pursuing your own unique visions and charting your own destinies in your own way. It's really incredible what you've done. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built.
Kate, what did you make of the president's speech?
Let's start with what I think was good in this speech. The president reiterated his bright line that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. And he blended pressure and outreach to Iran in a way that I thought was effective. He said, Iran can have a better future. It can dismantle its nuclear weapons, and it doesn't have to be an enemy of the United States forever. But it can never have a nuclear weapon or threaten America and its allies with terrorism or a nuclear attack. And this offer, this opening to make a deal, is not going to be on the table forever. So I think that represented some of the best of his impulses. And as we do see some murmurings in the press about a potential deal, the real $1 million question is whether he's willing to stick with that, because there are elements in of his administration that want a deal with Iran, even a bad one, because they don't want to have to follow through with the credible threat that the president is making of military action if Iran refuses to negotiate. So I think the seriousness on Iran continues to be a bright spot. But to your point, there was a lot of gratuitous stuff in this speech about nation building and neocons that I think is damaging to the United States abroad. Clearly, this was influenced by some of the same elements of his administration was just describing, who think that the U.S. mistakes in the Iraq War are a sin that basically we can never overcome. Trump is there in part to, as Elliot was saying, try to show the region that we're a better partner than China is, maintain our influence here. I think this is much harder to do if you are painting the United States as full of shortcomings and failures. So I think that part of the speech was gratuitous and unnecessary, and it was wrong about America's past. I think allowing our mistakes in Iraq to become a sort of modern Vietnam syndrome are really going to distract the president from his agenda and make it harder for us to confront these new, large, great power competition problems we have with China and Russia.
Ellie, what was your view of the speech and how it fits into the Trump administration's approach and strategy toward the Middle East, but also its broader foreign policy?
Yeah, I thought that his criticisms of his predecessors were, in poor form, and probably for the reasons Kate says, a bad idea. Um, I thought he had a good extended contrast of the Iran model and where that leads a country to, tremendous conflict. And really, he was actually specific. All the different countries in the Middle East to which Iran is spreading war to at the moment and how it's suffering economically for it, contrasting that with the Gulf states who have a different model. Some of them have been liberalizing recently and to have some prosperity to show for it, and certainly have America's friendship to show for it. I thought that was wiser. And I think the message that the region got probably weren't the things about neocons, maybe something about not lecturing them about this or that, although we should be careful when we say such things. I mean, there are people in these prisons, and America has to America has to pursue its interests, but it shouldn't. Every now and then, I think it should reflect on how does what we're saying sound to the people who are suffering like that for doing nothing wrong other than protest in this way or that way. But I think what they really heard were his changes in Syria policy outlined at that speech and what he wants to give the region a fresh start with those US allies in control, smoothing it over. It's a difficult policy, perhaps. It's a risky one, but I think they're looking forward to that, to being empowered by the US instead of being restrained all the time.
Part of what made that language about his predecessors in U.S. foreign policy so jarring, though, Kate, for people who've been paying attention to politics for a while, is just the change in the winds. Back in 2009, the U.S. had a new president who came into office who gave a series of speeches with, I think, more veiled criticisms of past U.S. foreign policy decisions. That was Barack Obama. In Cairo, he said this: 9/11 was an enormous trauma to our country. The fear and anger that it provoked was understandable, but in some cases, it led us to act contrary to our traditions and our ideals. In France, he said this: in America, there's a failure to appreciate Europe's leading role in the world. Instead of celebrating your dynamic union and seeking to partner with you to meet common challenges, there have been times when America has shown arrogance and been dismissive, even derisive. And Kate, Republicans said this was President Obama going on an apology tour, very hard on that kind of rhetoric. Mitt Romney, the opponent, the GOP nominee in 2012, wrote a book called No Apology: The Case for American Greatness. And so part of what makes this notable is it's maybe another place in our politics where up is now down and down is now up.
I do think there are some comparisons that are fair here. I mean, his willingness to go abroad and trash former U.S. presidents is something he now has in common with Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama. So again, I agree with Elliot that that was poor form, that it's gratuitous, and it undermines us. On the substance of Iran, I think the hope is that he will be much better than Obama and not go forward with a kind of nuclear deal that has gotten us to the position we are now, where Iran is on the brink of a nuclear weapon. So I think his rhetoric is terrible, but I am somewhat hopeful that he is willing to walk away from an Iran deal in a way that Obama wasn't.
While in Saudi Arabia, President Trump met with the new leader of Syria, Ahmed al Shara. This is the first meeting between a U.S. president and a Syrian president since 2000 under President Bill Clinton. Trump also said this: I will be ordering the cessation of sanctions against Syria in order to give them a chance at greatness, unquote. That was a move supported by Saudi Arabia, opposed by Israel. Elliot, who is Shara? Give listeners a sense of his background, and what do we make of the removal of U.S. sanctions against his new regime?
Ahmed al-Shara is a fascinating story. I don't know another parallel, someone who has had such an incredible rise like this. I mean, consider that he joined Al Qaeda and was fighting against the US in Iraq, was arrested by the US and held for some years. He founded uh, the Al Nusra Front, which was an Al Qaeda, jihadists, Salafi rebel group fighting Syria's dictator, Bashar al Assad. Um, at some point, he has a break with Al Qaeda. The details of that are disputed, but he sort of takes his own line, pursues his own policy, and leading a rebel coalition called HTS, and with the backing of Turkey primarily, is able to very suddenly overthrow Assad's regime. Um, Helped out by having that regime's uh, defenders, Iran, Hezbollah, weakened by Israel and fighting alongside Turkish proxies, he has this remarkable success. And then all of a sudden, he's the leader of Syria. And the question is what to do about somebody like that, who has that jihadist background, who in fact still has foreign, unreconstructed jihadists that he has named commanders of the new Syrian army. I mean, that's a fact. What do we do about that? But he isn't Assad. He is not in Iranian proxy. Iran was his enemy, uh, and we want it to stay that way. He also pushed Russia out of the country largely. We would also like it to stay that way. And so, do you give him a fresh start? Do you do it halfway? Do you say, I want all of these reforms first before I give you any sanctions relief? All of these policies were open. Turkey wanted full sanctions relief. The Saudis wanted a fresh start, but to make sure that the Turks weren't dominating Syria entirely, and to maybe wait and see how Shara does. And Israel did not trust him at all. What I heard from there was distrust and verify. Um, and I think what Trump has done by lifting sanctions, although it will be a bit of a lengthy process, and he has made a list of requests of Shara. And so maybe there is time to make those into sort of conditions for continuing sanctions relief. What he has done, though, I think, is to make the US a player in the scramble to shape the new Syria, which is a strategically important country, which can cut off Iran's supply line to Lebanon, and which can push out Russia and to some extent China from that part of the region. And so the US could have asked for more, in my view, and it may still do that. But it's a bold move, and it's probably important that Trump did this in Riyadh rather than in Ankara, an important signal against more Turkish domination of Syria.
Two other stories while we're podcasting live from the Middle East today. Kate, Elliot mentioned Ankara, the capital of Turkey. There's supposed to be a peace delegation meeting between Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and a Russian delegation. Vladimir Putin was invited, is reportedly not coming, but we are waiting to find out what is going to come of this meeting between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations. What should listeners expect out of that?
Putin is stiffing us. He's not showing up to the table to negotiate. He's trying to box Ukraine out of the negotiations and deal with the president. I think the president is tolerating that a bit too much. I think Zelensky has quite demonstrated his willingness to go and discuss the issues with the Russians, but what we have is a certain amount of intransigence on Putin's part. I do think this is an interesting subject because as you read closely that speech in Saudi Arabia, Trump mentions Ukraine and the human tragedy that's going on in that war as thousands die each week. And I don't want to diminish the human cost of the war, but Trump focuses exclusively on the war in moral terms, even as he says he is kind of the new realist in town who was only arguing for U.S. interests, and that's his number one job, and that it's not his job to sit in judgment as God. He used some version of that line. Well, then that's kind of what he does in the Ukraine situation. He talks about it as if this is a tragedy, like a natural disaster, and not a choice that Vladimir Putin made to invade Ukraine and to inflict all this horrible war in the world. But I do think Putin stiffing the United States this week is a bad decision on his part because I do think the president is getting frustrated with Putin and his unwillingness to negotiate. You do see a change in how the administration is talking about some of this. JD Vance said recently that they've made a good faith negotiation, but that the Russians are asking for too much, and they are asking for entire provinces that their military doesn't currently occupy, and have been very slow to walk back, even those of just completely non-starter, unreasonable demands. But I do think though the president is getting frustrated with Putin, and as he should be, as he continues to stiff the Ukrainians in real negotiations, you do have the Russian military making grinding, slow, awful progress in Ukraine's front and trying to continue its military assault. You also have Ukraine by pretty close to this summer will need a fresh infusion of ammunition from the United States to keep fighting. So this kind of long back and forth is not something the U.S. can continue to tolerate because Ukraine is going to need more weapons help, and I think that is ultimately where you'll see this story go.
Finally, the latest on the U.S. negotiations with Iran are some comments from the president. Here is the top of a CNN story. President Trump on Thursday said that Washington is very close to reaching a nuclear deal with Iran after Tehran sort of agreed to its terms. Elliot, how do you read those comments from the president, and particularly in light of the effort by Republicans to draw some hard lines on what a deal that they would approve of would look like in terms of uranium enrichment and denuclearization?
Well, it's always tough. You don't want to read in too much to each individual Trump comment on Iran because he's made a lot of them, and these negotiations go back and forth. As far as I can tell, this latest one was in response to a story about a senior Iranian advisor saying that Iran could accept limits on highly enriched uranium. Now, that's the Obama Iran deal from 2015. But what Trump, to some extent, and certainly his lead negotiator, Steve Witkoff, said quite clearly last week is that Iran can be allowed no enrichment of uranium, that is, not even low enriched. Why is that? Because that gets you two-thirds of the way to weapons grade right there. And once you concede something like that, Iran is close enough to a nuclear breakout that inspections, verification, it's no longer enough. And like you said, Republicans had been rallying around that version of the position. Every single Republican senator except one, Rand Paul, signed a letter saying no enrichment, no centrifuges. You can't leave Iran with this. It's quite simple. Uh, if Iran has centrifuges, it has a path to a nuclear bomb. It can enrich uranium to weapons grade. If it doesn't have centrifuges, it has no path. It cannot get to weapons grade uranium. So if the US sticks to that, a deal is not close because that is anathema uh, to Iran, and it'll take multiple back and forths. And right now, the U.S. has just presented its first offer. We don't expect Iran to fold just like that. However, if Trump is not insisting on that condition, allowing Iran enrichment, allowing another Obama style deal, well, then sure, a deal could very well be close at hand. But I think it's up to Trump.
But important then to see these Republicans signing a letter like that, Kate, and tying themselves to the mast, to use that analogy, drawing a line, at least for themselves, that if a Obama style deal, something similar to that, is what comes out of this negotiation with President Trump, it seems like it would be pretty hard for Republicans in Congress to support it after what they are currently saying, and in trying to box in these negotiations and make sure that the deal that Trump cuts is not like that.
I think Elliot is exactly right that if a deal is close, it's very likely to be a bad deal, given the Iranian intransigence on all of these particular issues. I think that Senate Republicans in this case are really representing the best of their party's tradition and basically making sure that the president follows through with a promise he made, which was that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. And as we've been describing, there are elements of the Trump administration that wouldn't mind a 2015 style Iran deal again that allows Iran to get to the brink of a nuclear weapon. And so Senate Republicans here, I think, have put down a marker and are stiffening the president's backbone that he needs to uh, follow through on what he said and walk away from the table if there isn't a deal that involves dismantlement to be had. And so I think that's how to read this is basically Republicans want the president to keep his promise and are trying to assert their own interest in that because that um, the Republican conference in the Senate is significantly more hawkish than on Iran. I think than the median member of the Trump administration. It is a core policy interest for many Republican members of the Senate. And so it won't be, even if it is a reminder that even if the president gets a deal, that it doesn't mean that Republicans will accept it. And I think that's why they're trying to help him here on the front side avoid a deal that is not going to be acceptable to them.
Thank you, Kate and Elliot. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.